The palace. Since the Sultan himself was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, the center of government was wherever he happened to be. This meant, par excellence, the palace, but when he left his residence, the government followed. Before the accession of Selim II, 1566–74, such absences were frequent, since sultans often led military expeditions in person, and were often absent from the capital during the campaigning season. When this happened, some at least of the sultan's ministers would accompany the campaign, as would the treasury to pay wages and make purchases, and clerks with financial and other registers to record, for example, deaths in battle and new appointments to replace the fallen. The early sultans were clearly very mobile. Ibn Battuta in 1333 described Orhan, circa 1324–62, as possessing nearly 100 fortresses, which he is continually visiting and putting to rights and appas. In the following century, the sultans became more sedentary than Orhan had been, but an annalist who compiled a chronology of the reign of Murad II, 1421–51, still noted whether the sultan during the summer went on campaign, remained in his capital, Edirne, or went to a summer resort. Mehmed II, 1451–81, it seems, continued the practice of spending time in upland pastures, at least as a means of escaping the plague epidemics which visited Istanbul, but after his time, it seems that the sultans normally left the palace only for military campaigns, hunting expeditions or pleasure trips. After 1566, with the exceptions of Mehmed III, 1595–1603, who accompanied the army to Hungary in 1596, Osman II, 1618–22, who led the Polish campaign of 1621, and Murad IV, 1623–40, who recaptured Yerevan in 1635 and Baghdad in 1638, the sultans no longer went to war in person. The palace, or rather, palaces, had become their permanent place of residence, which they rarely left. Thus, over 3.5 centuries, they gradually withdrew from daily contact with their subjects and, except on ceremonial occasions, from public view. It is not clear whether Osman, the first of the Ottoman line, established a permanent residence. Ottoman tradition, however, presents him as declaring his sovereignty at a town called Karacahisar, which may correspond to the Greek town of Malagina in the Sakarya Valley. This was the site of a Byzantine bishopric, and it is possible that Osman took up residence there in the old bishop's palace. It was also at Malagina that the captive Greek cleric, Gregory Palamas, met Orhan in 1354, describing it as a village built on a hill, surrounded by mountains, enjoying a cool climate even in summer. 2 days an appas journey from Bursa. Orhan's successor, Murad I, 1362–89, seems also to have spent time in the same place. The Genoese in 1387 did not conclude their treaty with him in the royal capital of Bursa, but at Malagina. The text records that it was enacted in Turkey in a certain small settlement called Malin, inhabited by the aforesaid Lord '2. By the time of Orhan, however, Bursa was the royal capital and site of the Ottoman palace, although details of this building are elusive. Orhan must have taken over or constructed a royal residence at Bursa after he had captured it in 1326, and his successors continued to reside there at times until 1402, when a detachment of Timur's army pillaged the city. It did not survive the sack as a main residence, but it seems that, until the 16th century, members of the Sultan's family, such as his grandchildren, might live there. Orhan's successor, Murad I, built the first palace of which there is a description, and which was to become a far more important residence than whatever survived or was rebuilt at Bursa after 1402. This is the old palace at Edirne, which the Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi was to describe when it was still standing in the second half of the 17th century. Murad must have started building immediately after the conquest of the city, probably therefore in the early 1370s. According to Evliya, Prince Musa, Ramelia, 1411–13, extended and fortified the building. Its massive outer wall, Evliya tells us, formed a square with a single iron gate in the north side. This is probably much as Bertrandin de la Broquière had seen it in 1433, when he had entered the palace by this gate, and seen Sultan Murad II emerge from his chamber into a very large courtyard, and take his seat in a gallery along its end. These accounts suggest that the buildings within the palace were ranged within a square outer wall, around a single courtyard. In 1451, the last year of his life, Murad II began the construction of a second palace in Edirne, which was to replace the old palace as a royal residence. 3 Although By the time of its completion in 1454, work had already begun on a palace in the newly conquered Istanbul. The Edirne Palace continued in use. Murad began the construction outside the city, on the west bank of the river Tunka. His son, Mehmed II, continued the work, again on a plan of buildings ranged around an inner and an outer courtyard. He also constructed a bridge from the palace to the island in the river, which was to serve as a pleasure garden and a hunting ground. Successive sultans added to the palace. Suleiman I, 1520-66, Evliya Çelebi remarks, spent his winters here when he returned from his Hungarian campaigns. He added a bridge from the eastern bank of the river to the island, water depots, and an imperial chamber in the harem. His successors added kiosks, but the palace was to reach its greatest size during the reign of Mehmed IV, 1648-87, who, as his contemporary, Evliya Çelebi, notes, because he is fond of hunting, spends most of his time in the city of Edirne and Apas. The conquest of Istanbul meant that the Edirne Palace did not become the chief royal residence except during the reign of Mehmed IV. In 1454, Mehmed II ordered the construction of a new palace in the center of the city, on the site of the Byzantine Forum of the Bull. By 1458, it was complete. The contemporary historian, Tursun Bey, informs us that, within the square formed by the outer walls, he constructed the imperial harem to whose courtyard the sun could not find a path. Delightful palaces and pavilions for his enjoyment, and for the comfort of his intimates and pages. Protected by trustworthy and pious eunuchs and Apas, between the palace buildings and the outer walls, he created a private hunting ground, filling it with wild beasts and Apas. This palace did not long remain in use as the Sultan's principal residence and as the seat of his government. When building work was finished, Mehmed II immediately ordered the construction of a new palace. On its completion, the old palace became exclusively a residence for the women of the imperial harem. The site which the new palace was to occupy seems to have appealed to Mehmed's imperial ambition. Its outer gate led to the Hagia Sophia, to the Ottoman imperial mind, a symbol of Roman sovereignty, and it occupied a hill on a promontory, commanding views from Europe over to Asia, and across the Bosphorus which links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The building work took place during the 1460s and 1470s, according to a basic plan which has survived the numerous additions and alterations of later centuries. An outer wall divided the new palace and its extensive gardens from the city, with the old city walls along the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara protecting it from the seaward side. The palace itself occupied the highest position within this enclosure. Entrance was by the imperial gate, close to the apse of the Hagia Sophia, and leading into the first courtyard. Once through the gate, the visitor saw on the left the Byzantine church of St. Irene, which served as an armory for the palace, and ranged around the courtyard were the dormitories of the novices, storehouses and other domestic and service areas. One may imagine the court as an area of activity and noise. At the far end, opposite the imperial gate was the middle gate, crenellated and flanked with two Frankish towers. Through this gate was the second court. Entry was permissible only to members of the court and government, and to members of the public who were presenting petitions to the Sultan's imperial council. No one, apart from the Sultan, could enter the court on horseback, and strict silence was the rule. Commentators in the 17th century remarked on the use of sign language in the palace, and this, no doubt, enabled courtiers to communicate. In the far left corner, the visitor saw the council chamber, which Suleiman I, 1520-66, was to replace in the 1520s, with a more imposing building. It was here that the Imperial Council, the central organ of the Sultan's government, held its sessions. Ahead lay the Gate of Felicity, with a colonnade on either flank. On the right were the vast kitchens, which the architect Sinan, d. 1588, was to renovate after a fire in 1574, and, behind the wall on the left, the imperial stables. These simple structures formed a backdrop for the elaborate ceremonials of the court. The third court, beyond the Gate of Felicity, was the private residence of the Sultan and inaccessible not only to the public but even, except on formal occasions, to the empire statesmen. Immediately behind the gate stood the Chamber of Petitions, which Suleiman I was to reconstruct at the same time as he built the new council chamber. It was here that the Sultan gave audiences and received foreign embassies. When imperial decrees refer to petitioners submitting their letters to my threshold of felicity or to my exalted threshold in Apas, they refer, metaphorically, to the Sultan seated in the Chamber of Petitions on the threshold of Gate of Felicity. In the far right corner of the third court itself stood the Sultan's inner treasury and the bathhouse. In the far left was the Sultan's privy chamber. Behind the court, where the land sloped steeply to the sea, was a garden. Later sultans were to add new structures to the third court, most notably perhaps the Yerevan Pavilion and the Baghdad Pavilion, which Murad IV, 1623-40 added to celebrate the reconquest of these cities. The third court, as the sultan's private residence, gave entrance to the harem. In Mehmed II's original plan, this seems to have been small, but it appears that more women came to live in the palace during the course of the 16th century. This tendency began probably in the reign of Suleiman I, during the ascendancy of his wife, Hurrem, before her death in 1558, and became particularly pronounced during the reign of Murad III, 1574-95, who moved his privy chamber into the harem. It was during the reign of Mehmed III, 1595-1603, that the Queen Mother and her entourage took up residence in the palace. It grew still further in the early 17th century, when the practice of sending the princes to governorships in Anatolia ceased, and the practice of royal fratricide was no longer normal. On the death of a sultan, however, the ladies of his harem left for the old palace, which remained, apart from the eunuchs, an exclusively female residence. The two buildings in the third court, to either side of the main gate, were the Great Chamber and the Small Chamber. It was here that the sultan's pages lived and received their education, since many of these were to graduate from service as courtiers in the inner palace to service in governing the empire. The chambers in some ways were the foundations of the sultan's power.